Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about contempt of court. Stay tuned. What follows after this little introduction is the original video, with the exception of a segment I had to remove because I got a copyright claim. Now, it wasn't a copyright strike, but somebody got upset because I used a clip from Pulp Fiction. So I've removed that clip and will simply say this. One of the sanctions that Judge Doro could have levied would have been contempt, but I'm glad she didn't. And there is a scene in Pulp Fiction where Samuel L. Jackson talks about striking down the person who was poisoning his brothers. That was sort of the way I felt like Judge Doro must have felt at the end of that trial. So without further ado, let's go to version 2.0 of my contempt sanctions video. So contempt of court boils down to one of two things. It's either civil contempt or it's criminal contempt. Let's look at those. When Darrell Brooks was acting the way he was acting in criminal court, he could very easily have been found in violation of what's called direct contempt. Direct contempt is where you insult the judge, argue with the judge, disobey a direct order from the judge. If a judge tells a lawyer to sit down, they need to go sit down. You saw that in the Parkland trial where she rebuked the defense attorney and he went and sat down. He didn't argue with her. He was smart in that regard because he knows that's direct contempt, or at least that he could have been cited for direct contempt. So direct contempt is really fairly rare. You very rarely see people like Darrell Brooks getting into it with the judge and dusting things up in a courtroom. It doesn't happen because, for the most part, people have respect for judges. Now, civil contempt is of two kinds. It certainly can be direct contempt, as we just talked about, but it can also be criminal contempt. Let's get into that. So, what is indirect contempt? Let's suppose that you are that you're trying to buy a piece of land. And you go to the guy and you say, I want to buy this piece of land and I'll buy it for $10,000. And you hand the guy a check for $10,000 at closing and he says, you know what, I've changed my mind. I'm not selling it to you. In that situation, you have a remedy in the law for breach of contract because you made an agreement. You made a contract to sell that land for $10,000. He is now in breach of that contract. And so you can sue him. And in suing, you ask for what's called specific performance. Specific performance means that the person will be required to do the thing that he refused to do. In this case, turn over the land or sign the deed over to you. But you go through the court proceeding, you get a judgment in your favor, and he still will not sign the deed. So the judge in that situation would issue what's called a show cause order. And the order basically says, come before my court on this date and explain to me, show cause why I should not find you in contempt. So the person then has the opportunity to come into court and say, I broke my hand, or I didn't know the gun was loaded. Any number of excuses that they think might convince the judge not to hold them in contempt. But if the judge finds by a preponderance of the evidence, in other words, it doesn't have to be beyond a reasonable doubt, just by more likely than not likely that they are in violation of this order and that they've done so contumaciously, then in that situation, he will order them to do one of two things. He can either order a fine that goes up that is paid every day until the deed is done, or he can put them in jail. He can incarcerate them immediately until such time as they sign the deed. And then once they sign the deed, they're out. Now, you may wonder how you can put somebody in jail and it not be criminal. Here's the answer. When you are engaging in civil contempt and you are not complying with an order, the only thing you have to do in order to let yourself out of jail is comply with the order. So you've got the keys to the jailhouse right in your own pocket. And as a result, there are fewer safeguards and fewer protections for someone who is guilty of indirect contempt of court. That doesn't mean that you can't be guilty of criminal contempt as well. So, for example, you may have been subject to a fine. In some states, for example, the failure to pay child support or the failure to pay maintenance, what used to be called alimony, can be criminal contempt. And in that situation, you could draw 10 days in jail for every instance or every count. For example, suppose you missed 3 months of payments, you could draw 10 days in jail for each of those 3 counts and a fine of $100 for each of those 3 counts. And in that way, the court can punish you for contempt of court. Now, one of the things that sometimes happens in direct contempt of court is that it's treated as criminal contempt of court and you can be incarcerated and fined. But when it is treated as criminal contempt of court, you have certain due process protections. You have the right to have an attorney. You have a right to contest. You have a right to present a defense. All of these things inhere in the notion of being charged criminally for contempt of court. And here's the other thing. Normally, when a judge issues a criminal contempt citation, he will not sit in judgment of that criminal contempt case. It is presumed that he has already decided that there was criminal contempt. It is up to a second judge to determine if there actually was contempt. So, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the court rules, and depending on the state's precedents in the area of contempt, there are numerous ways that contempt can be punished. And I would add that in addition to having the keys in the pocket of the in a criminal contempt situation or a civil contempt situation, you also have the writ of habeas corpus. You can file a writ of habeas corpus if you believe that the judge has made a glaring error. And the habeas corpus, if it's granted, then the underlying legal question that caused the civil contempt issue to arise may then be elevated to a superior court for decision in an appellate context. Again, all of these things are rather unusual. Judges try very hard not to hold people in contempt. I think there is this image of the judge as a stern, mean person with a hammer that he brings down on people's heads. And that is very, very rarely the case. There are a few federal judges who are like that. And in many cases, they tend to be older male judges that tend to act that way. But that doesn't mean that that's always going to happen. If you take a look at what Judge Doro did in the Darrell Brooks case, she studiously avoided the issue of contempt because that would have been used in the appellate context to prove bias. So I hope that helps make it a little more understanding about civil contempt, criminal contempt, direct and indirect contempt. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I've had a few comments recently that trend in the area of being profane. If you disagree, it's fine to disagree. Just try to remember that YouTube is used by a wide range of people, and they really don't want to watch and read a lot of unkind words. So thank you again for watching. I hope you have a marvelous day, and God bless you.